Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for the next part in our examination of the Satipatthana Sutta. So today we'll be looking at a section on mindfulness of mind. But first we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, in the previous sessions, we went through the first two Satipatthanas. So, Satipatthana of Kayanupassana, observing the body, and Vedananupassana, so observing sensation or feeling. Today we'll be looking at Chittanupassana, which is observation of the mind, which is a very important element of Satipatthana practice. And all these elements are important, otherwise they wouldn't be in the sutta. But this one is particularly important. As usual, we'll go through the text in Pali, and I'll give some explanation as we go along. And then you can put in questions at any time, and I'll take them at the end. So this section begins similarly to the previous ones. The Buddha says, Katancha panabhikkhave bhikkhu chitte chittanupassi viharati. So how does one practice observing the mind? So chitta we normally translate as mind. And in the Pali texts, there's two words which are used almost interchangeably. So chitta and mano, both of which mean mind. And they're almost synonymous. But they can be clearly distinguished from the word vijnana, which we normally translate consciousness. So vijnana usually refers to sensory awareness. So chakku vijnana is awareness of one's visual field. Sota vijnana is awareness of one's auditory field, and so on. Whereas chitta and mano, so these words that we translate mind, it refers to the experience within the mind itself. So the experience of emotions and thoughts and so on. And this particular Satipatthana is emphasizing awareness of the current attributes or qualities of mind, as well as emotional states would also be included in this section. So the Buddha gives a series of examples of attributes or characteristics which one might observe in one's present mind state. So he begins, he says, Ita bhikkhave bhikkhu saragang va chittang saragang chittanti pajanati. So he's saying here when one's mind has raga, so raga means passion or lust, but it should be understood if we translate raga as lust, that this is not referring specifically to sexual craving, though that can be one element of raga, but rather towards a powerful, obsessive desire towards anything. And actually translating raga as passion is perhaps a bit more relevant, because one can be passionate about literally anything. And part of the nature of a mind that is full of passion is that it tends to lose self-restraint. It tends to lose clarity and is often prone to acting impulsively. So acting without careful consideration, acting without the proper influence of conscience. So when one's mind is full of passion for something, then one tends to discard all of one's other priorities and to focus on one's passion. Which, if one is passionate about something wholesome, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be quite a good thing. In a few places in the suttas, the Buddha uses the term Dhamma Raga, which means a passion for Dhamma. Translating it as lust for Dhamma would be a little bit strange, but passion for Dhamma is actually quite reasonable. And the Buddha describes Dhamma Raga as being a wholesome state of mind. So something which supports one in developing one's practice effectively. But normally, most of the time when we talk about raga, we're talking about an unwholesome state of mind, which is characterized by this unwise, blind, impulsive passion, this desire, craving, attachment, motivated not by a wise desire to practice Dhamma, but rather by some other kind of more base or lowly impulse. But here the Buddha, again, is emphasizing first just to clearly understand. If there is passion present in the mind, then to understand that there's passion present in the mind. Similarly, the next one he gives, vitaragang vachittang vitaragang chittanti pajanati. So vitaraga, vita means without. So if the mind is free of passion, then recognizing that the mind is free of passion, that it's free of, again, this obsessive fixation of mind. And the word vitaraga, by the way, might sound very similar to the word viraga because they're actually effectively synonymous. So viraga we normally translate as dispassion, which again is quite a good translation. Vitaraga means without passion. So they're almost synonymous. Next example, he says, sadosang vachittang sadosang chittanti pajanati. So when the mind has dosa, so dosa, what we might translate as aversion or negativity, sometimes translated as hate, though that can be a little bit strong as a translation, but it's good enough. So understanding when the mind has any kind of aversion or negativity or hostility present, we recognize that that's what's going on in the mind. And similarly, the next one, vita dosang vachittang vita dosang chittanti pajanati. So when there is no dosa present in the mind, when the mind is free of aversion, negativity, hostility. And the next one, samohang vachittang samohang chittanti pajanati, vita mohang vachittang vita mohang chittanti pajanati. This is the really difficult one. So when the mind has moha, when the mind has delusion or confusion, and to recognize that. And if the mind is free of delusion and confusion, then to recognize that as well. So what makes this difficult is that when the mind is full of moha, when it's full of delusion and confusion, the mind is often too blurry to really understand what's going on, to recognize what's going on. But we might have enough presence to recognize that the mind is confused and blurry. So as one becomes increasingly aware of one's own mind, then you start to recognize that mental clarity has a particular feel, whereas mental blurriness or confusion has a distinctly different feel. So there's a big difference between, for example, practicing mindfulness of the body with attention solidly focused on clearly feeling your physical sensations versus drifting off into some daydream or fantasy when you're supposed to be meditating. So there's a distinctly different feeling. So that feeling of drifting off into imagination has this blurry, nebulous, cloudy, unreal feeling, a surreal quality to it. Like everything is a little bit out of focus. Whereas the quality of being completely present with one's experience, it has the attribute of this razor sharp precision in the mind. Like the mind is completely crystal clear. And again, this is something which is quite noticeable when you start to pay attention to it. You can feel that distinction in the mind. The next pair that the Buddha gives, he says, Sankittang vachittang sankittang chittanti pajanati. So sankitta, normally we would translate this word as contracted. So sankitta has the prefix sang, which means together. And the section kitta, it actually comes from the verb kipati, which means to throw or scatter. So sankitta means when the mind is pulled together. So this is sometimes translated as contracted, but this can also be understood in the sense of meaning that the mind is collected. And particularly because the next word that the Buddha gives, which is presented as being the opposite, vikkitang vachittang vikkitang chittanti pajanati. The word vikkitta means dispersed or scattered. So the prefix vi means apart or separated. So vikkitta means the mind is thrown apart. It's scattered and separated in many different directions. So it's dispersed or scattered. So when the mind is dispersed or scattered, then to understand that that's what's going on in the mind is all over the place. Whereas sankitta, so when the mind is collected, it's gathered together, then to understand that that's the current condition of mind. So some scholars take the word sankitta here in a negative sense. So in the sense of narrowed attention. But I think that's missing the Buddha's point here. So as we look through this section here, the Buddha is always giving it as pairs. So two states of mind, one which is negative and one which is positive. And not always in that order. In some cases, the order is switched. So similarly here, since vikkitta is clearly a negative state when the mind is scattered and dispersed, then sankitta then would seem to mean a positive state. So in this case, it's contracted in the sense of collected. The mind is holding together rather than going all over the place. Then the next phrase the Buddha gives, so mahagatang vachittang mahagatang chittanti pajanati, amahagatang vachittang amahagatang chittanti pajanati. So here the pair he's giving is mahagata and amahagata. So mahagata has two parts. So the word maha, which means large or great, and gata, which just means gone. So mahagata means it's gone to a state of largeness or greatness. So this is sometimes translated as expansive, whereas amahagata would mean not expanded, not expansive, so limited or narrow. So again, this is recognizing, well, what's going on in the mind? Does the mind have a vast open field of awareness or not? Is the mind actually feeling very narrow and limited? So this also is relevant in the development of samadhi practice. So when the mind is broad and expansive, then the mind, it's actually much easier to cultivate equanimity because you're aware of everything that's moving within the field of awareness. So you're not caught off guard by anything. And also one is maintaining a broad open field of mindfulness. So cultivating the ability to be clearly aware of everything within one's experience. Then the next pair that the Buddha gives, sa uttarang vachittang sa uttarang chittanti pajanati, anuttarang vachittang anuttarang chittanti pajanati. So sa uttara and anuttara. So uttara means higher or greater. So sa uttarang chittang means a mind which there's something better which is possible. And anuttarang means there's nothing better. There's nothing higher. So an anuttarang chittang actually is only the mind of a fully awakened being. They're the only being who can be said to have an anuttarang chittang, a mind which is unsurpassable. Whereas sa uttarang chittang means a mind which can be surpassed. It can be improved and developed further. So recognizing, here this is basically saying recognize whether your mind is at an unsurpassed level of development. Is the mind fully perfected? Or is there still progress to be done? And so for most of us, the answer is going to be our mind is sa uttara. It's not yet unsurpassable. There's still more improvement to be made. Then the next list, samahitang va chittang samahitang chittanti pajanati, asamahitang va chittang asamahitang chittanti pajanati. So samahita is the past participle form of the word samadhi. So samahitang chittang means a mind that is in samadhi, a mind that is unified, collected, and concentrated. So the development of samadhi that the Buddha most commonly talks about is the practice of the 4 jhanas. So these increasingly refined and stable states of unified, collected, concentrated stillness, which in order to be correct samadhi, as the Buddha described it, must be accompanied by extremely sharp, clear awareness and alertness. So understanding, is the mind concentrated or not concentrated? Is the mind unified or not unified? So being aware of what degree of samadhi the mind is currently in. And here it's given as a strict binary. So either the mind is in samadhi or not in samadhi. But our actual experience is usually more of a percentage. So you wake up in the morning and the mind is very blurry and hazy, so you've got about 1% samadhi. And you go and you do some meditation in the morning and maybe you get up to about 5% samadhi. And then you turn on some heavy metal and watch TV and you go down to about 0.1% samadhi and so on. So the mind goes up and down as you go throughout the day. And then in the course of an intensive meditation retreat, then you might get your samadhi up to 50%, 70%. So cultivating this much more stable, unified collectedness of mind. So whether you're thinking of it in strictly binary terms or in terms of a spectrum, the point here again is to be aware of how strong your samadhi is at any given time. Then the last couplet that he gives is Vimutang va chittang vimutang chittanti pajanati, avimutang va chittang avimutang chittanti pajanati. So the word vimutta means liberated. And in the suttas, this is used in a couple different ways. So in the loftiest sense, vimutta or liberation means complete awakening. So full enlightenment, the end goal of Buddhist practice. But it's also sometimes used in a more narrow sense. So first, it's sometimes used to mean strong samadhi states, because when one is in jhana, or the formless attainments, then the mind is temporarily free from coarse defilements. So the mind is not permanently liberated, but it's temporarily liberated. It's temporarily free from defilements and hindrances. And vimutta is also used in terms of the 10 fetters. So as one attains stages of awakening, so stream enterer, once returner, and non-returner, then one becomes liberated from the first several fetters. But one is not yet completely liberated But these are irreversible stages of liberation along the path towards complete awakening. So again, recognizing the mind. Is the mind currently in the grip of defilements and hindrances? Or is it currently free from defilements and hindrances? So that would be the basic sense in terms of concentration. And also recognizing, has there been some genuine transformation of mind, which brings about permanent freedom from some degree of defilement? Which again, for the vast majority of people, the answer is going to be no. There's still quite a ways to go in order to liberate the mind permanently from any degree of defilement. So with all these states or attributes of mind, so here the Buddha is talking simply about awareness. So understanding the current condition of mind. But it is very important when reading through this paragraph to remember that this comes in the context of the Noble Eightfold Path. It comes in the context of the threefold training. It comes in the context of everything else the Buddha said. So actually find it's very important to contrast this to, for example, the Sabasava Sutta, where the Buddha actually talks quite clearly about how when one looks at one's mind and sees that there is passion, aversion, or any kind of unwholesome mind state present, then one should make an active conscious effort to remove that from the mind. So it's not enough just to sit back and watch as your defilements splatter all over the place. But rather, once we recognize that defilements are present in the mind, then we should make an effort to do something about it. Or if you look at your mind and you see that your mind is scattered and all over the place and you have no samadhi and you're very distracted, well, you don't just sit back and watch as you waste time, but rather you make some effort to stabilize and collect and focus the mind. Similarly, if you recognize that your mind is not liberated, well, then you make an effort to liberate the mind. So the Buddha here, he's talking first about just being aware of what's going on in the mind. But it's important to keep in mind that awareness alone is not sufficient. We also need to make an effort to remove the unwholesome and develop the wholesome. Then the Buddha concludes with the usual refrain, the usual closing statement. So, iti ajatang va chitte chittana pasivaharati, bahidha va chitte chittana pasivaharati, ajata bahidha va chitte chittana pasivaharati. So one practices observing the mind internally or externally, or both internally and externally. So as I spoke about yesterday, there's endless debates about what internal and external mean, particularly here in the case of the mind. How can you observe the mind externally? Is that talking about observing other people's minds? Or is it talking about the mind in relationship to external phenomena? Again, it's unclear, and the scholarly debates on this seem endless. So as I mentioned yesterday, I think it's better just to take it as meaning an all-inclusive awareness of mind. So not partitioning off the mind of like, well, I'm going to pay attention to these aspects of the mind, but not those. But rather it's this all-inclusive awareness of whatever attributes or qualities or conditions are currently present in the mind. Then, as before, observing samudaya dhammanupasiva chittasming viharati, vaya dhammanupasiva chittasming viharati, samudaya vaya dhammanupasiva chittasming viharati. So observing the arising and ceasing of all these attributes of mind, the constant change, the constant appearing and vanishing of attributes and qualities of mind. So again, this is quite interesting in that, for example, if aversion appears in the mind, so there's some kind of hatred or negativity in the mind, well, if you watch it, you'll see that it appears and vanishes. So it's constantly coming and going. It's constantly shifting and changing. It's not always there. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not there. Sometimes it's weak and sometimes it's strong. So when we observe the impermanence of these different attributes of mind, then we also recognize that it doesn't define us or control us, but rather these are just temporary experiences, temporary phenomena, which arise based upon causes and conditions, but which are not the fundamental nature of the mind. Rather, they're temporary attributes which don't define the nature of mind itself, and which don't define who we are, and they don't limit or control our capacities. They don't determine our capabilities. So through observing in clear detail, observing the attributes of mind and recognizing that they're constantly appearing and vanishing, then one can start to discover what's beneath that, what's behind that, what's the true nature of mind. And then, as before, the Buddha also says, atichittang ti vapanasa satipachupachita hoti yavadeva jnanamataya patisati mataya. So, or one establishes mindfulness to the extent necessary in order to clearly know and be aware of the existence of the mind. So this is just this basic level of observing the mind without going into detail, without necessarily dividing things up into categories and observing appearing and vanishing and so on, but just constantly observing the mind moment by moment. So this is the most basic baseline form of this particular practice, just observing the mind as it does whatever it does. And again, the Buddha says, anisito chevaharati, so one dwells independent, not dwelling on anything. So whatever appears in the mind, we don't dwell on it. We don't try to build our home on it. Rather, we watch as things come and go. So not relying upon or depending upon any of these temporary and impersonal attributes of mind. And again, he says, nachikanchi loke upadhyati, and one does not cling to anything in the world. So no matter what appears, we don't try to grab it and hold on to it. But rather we recognize that everything which is appearing it's inherently impossible to hold on to. So we just let it flow through. And he says, evam piko bhikkhave bhikkhu chitte chittanapassivaharati. So he says, in this way, one practices observing the mind. So that's the end of the third Satipatthana. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And at this time, I can take any questions that you might have. So first off, hello to the people joining in online. So hello to John, Melissa, Jayanta, Gita, Matthias, Yankee, Diego, Bhumika, Anil, Sud, Olga, Siyong, Gyana, Richard, and Juliana. So welcome. And I see one question so far online. So anonymous Facebook user says, I think there is some misunderstanding in Satipatthana. Otherwise, millions of people are doing Satipatthana, but I haven't met a single person who got nirvana. Well, first off, yes, there most certainly are misunderstandings about Satipatthana. I've met a lot of people who have very strange ideas about what this practice is or what this sutta means. And that's not surprising. And the Buddha himself, when he attained awakening, he said this Dhamma is exceedingly subtle and profound, and very few people will understand it. Nonetheless, he taught because he saw that there were a small number of people who would understand. But right from the beginning, the Buddha was clearly aware most people are not going to get this. He still tried, because that's the nature of a Sammasambuddha, is that they have the infinite compassion to try to share Dhamma. But there's the awareness that most people are not going to understand. So yes, the Buddha taught Satipatthana, and yes, many people do not understand it. That's exactly true. As for there being lots of people who do Satipatthana, but few who attain nirvana, well, there's good reasons for that. One is because Satipatthana is only one aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. So Satipatthana is the Samma Sati aspect, but there's 7 other aspects to the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you're not doing all 8, then your odds of attaining awakening are quite small. So you can't expect to just do some Satipatthana and attain full awakening just doing that. But rather you need to be practicing the complete Eightfold Path. So actually I've met lots of people who they do plenty of meditation, and they've read the Satipatthana Sutta, and maybe even gone on a bunch of meditation retreats. But their practice of generosity is close to non-existent. Their morality is extremely flexible, shall we say. And they're not really much interested in developing samadhi. And it's like, well, of course your practice isn't going anywhere. You're trying to practice with only a tiny fragment of what the Buddha taught. Of course you're not getting anywhere close to nirvana. And of course there's also a lot of misunderstandings around samadhi. So there's this pervasive view of this like blackout samadhi, this idea that if you're practicing meditation correctly, that at some point you should black out. But this is the exact opposite of what the Buddha taught. So we're not trying to make the mind go into some black hole, but rather we're trying to develop an incredibly sharp and precise awareness of exactly what's going on moment by moment. So, and then even if one is practicing correctly, and again, most people aren't practicing particularly correctly, but even if someone is practicing exactly precisely correctly, there's still the fact that this is an incredibly long and difficult path. And if one has not already been practicing for many lifetimes, then one's odds of attaining full awakening in this life are quite low. So most people, even if they are practicing correctly, most people are just creating the conditions for awakening in a future life. They're not likely to get anywhere close in this life. What they are doing is laying the foundations for advanced practice in future lives. And that's also fine. And that's what most of us have been doing for many, many lifetimes. That's what the Buddha himself did for hundreds of lifetimes. That's what all the Buddha's main disciples did for many, many lifetimes. So that's also perfectly fine. But yeah, very, very few people attain awakening in this life. It's very difficult. It's very rare. It requires very advanced practice conditions. And Sud says, there's the breath during meditation to anchor the mind. Is there an anchor that one should use to keep the mind in the present moment while doing these practices outside of meditation? Your body. Focus on your body, the sensations of your body. A really powerful practice is mindfulness of your feet, constantly focusing on the feeling of your feet, especially whenever you're walking or standing. It's a very effective way of keeping the mind mindful and present. And Diego says, when doing Satipatthana, should I go through all 4 in order? Can one jump straight to Chitta some days, straight to Vedana on others, etc.? You can do it in whatever order you like, or you can focus on just one at a time. You don't necessarily need to do all 4 in one sitting, and you don't necessarily need to do them in sequence. It's actually perfectly normal to pick one Satipatthana and just focus on that. Yeah, you don't necessarily need to do all 4 in one session. An anonymous Facebook user, probably the same one from before, says, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha gave the guarantee that if a person does Satipatthana for 7 days to 7 years, they will reach Anagami or Arhat. Yeah, the Buddha did say that. Look again at what exactly he said, though. So it's if one is practicing in this way correctly, unceasingly, unflinchingly, with complete dedication and full understanding, then it's possible to attain awakening in, yeah, he said 7 years or even as little as 7 days. That's true. Yeah, he did say that. So that's assuming you're practicing with 100% dedication and 100% understanding. And it's also assuming that you've already cultivated the necessary karmic conditions of mind, which means that you already have been practicing dana and sila. You've already developed the necessary karmic conditions. Then yeah, it is possible to attain awakening in a few days or even a few seconds, if you've developed the proper pre-existing conditions. So last question from online. Anything here? Yes, Simon, you're meant to go.
I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. In terms of, and I think related to Sue's question in terms of, and also looking at some of the Buddha's words of following the mind with loving kindness, the Brahma Viharas, having it all expansive. How do you see that carrying through, let's say, in everyday practice, just being aware of the mind filled with loving kindness?
Yeah, that would qualify. So being aware of metta would actually fit under Cittanupassana. So observing the aspect of metta in the mind. So the list of attributes that the Buddha gives here, it's not meant to be exhaustive. Mm-hmm. It's meant to be examples. Right. So yeah, awareness of metta would also fit under Cittanupassana. And yes, metta is considered a mahagata citta, so an expansive mind. And actually practicing metta as you go throughout your day is one way of constantly maintaining awareness of your mind, of keeping Cittanupassana as you go throughout the day. And actually Sud asked, how does metta fit into all this? So that was, you're clearly on the same page on this one. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I found in my own practice, like last night, I was able to spot, oh, the mind is angry, there's angry mind. But it was felt different than ill will in terms of, this might be related to mindfulness of Dhamma, which will be, I believe, your next talk. So knowing like ill will is arising and is separate from the mind is angry, it almost feels like, when there's ill will, it almost feels like thought formations or like intentions or like images, while the angry mind just seems more like the potential, almost like clouds, dark clouds are forming, and like ill will is like lightning that's kind of forming. And when you can catch the mind, when I catch the mind that being angry, it's much easier to do the metta practice, because it feels like once it gets into ill will, it's harder to like dismantle those formations. Is that accurate practice in terms of spotting that?
Well, I mean, there are of course many different shades of mind states. So we tend to talk in very broad categories. So the word dosa is a very broad category which encompasses a wide range of mind states. And I'm actually not aware of any language which really has a particularly rich depth of vocabulary for describing these mind states. Actually, Pali doesn't have that many words for describing different mind states. So we have words like dosa, patiga, and a few others, which, again, there's mild distinctions between them, but it doesn't come close to the degree of difference that you can recognize in your own mind. So like, again, we talk about colors. You say the word red. Well, how many different shades of red are there? Technically, there's an infinite variety of different shades of red. So it's the same. We talk about dosa. How many different varieties of dosa are there? Technically, there's a limitless different number of varieties of dosa. So I wouldn't necessarily go into detail of saying like, well, anger feels like this, and ill will feels like this, and hostility feels like this, and resentment feels like this. You can do that if you want to, but the point is more to be just aware of the current condition of mind. As for how to extract the mind from an unwholesome state, yeah, depending upon the nature of that unwholesome state, then different tactics will have different levels of effectiveness. I've usually found that metta works much better as a vaccine rather than as a treatment. So constantly saturating the mind with metta when the mind is already okay-ish, then prevents the mind from falling into any kind of dosa state. So it prevents the dosa from getting a hold in the mind in the first place. Once the mind is already in a dosa state, personally, I find doing metta is really, really difficult. Usually more effective is to put the mind on something completely different. Actually, recollection of death tends to work really well, or recollection of the Buddha, or just coming back to the body. So it's more like pulling the mind away from that mental activity. And then once the mind is in more of a neutral state, then you can do metta more effectively. But this is my experience. It's not this case for everyone. Some people can go directly from aversion to metta. So it depends upon each individual.
May I ask a follow-up? So I remember watching videos of Venerable Mahabua, and I noticed now he would say the chitta, and he wouldn't say it's my mind, he would say the mind. And so we should make a practice of not saying my mind, we should say the chitta is like this in this present moment. And should we not, is it relevant that I mentioned how the chitta was last night? Should I only be concerned with how the chitta is in this present moment?
Well, first off, I think it's totally fine to use words like I, me, and mine, because otherwise language gets really messy and complicated. There's actually an amusing sutta where some devas came and started criticizing the Buddha, saying like, oh, you claim to teach not self, but you and your monks are always going around saying like, well, I am going to get my bowl so I can go to my mealtime. And the devas are like, you're hypocrites. You claim to teach not self, but you're always talking about self. And the Buddha says, basically he says that these words are just conventions that we use for the sake of communication. So the difference is that an ordinary person uses words like I, me, and mine while really believing in them. Whereas someone with sufficient wisdom, they use these words knowing that they're inherently meaningless and they're being used purely for the sake of communication. Otherwise, conversation gets really awkward. So it's like, these 5 khandhas need for those 5 khandhas to go and wash the dishes that belong to the other 5 khandhas. It's just like, we just can't talk anymore. But instead it's saying like, I want you to help him with the dishes, then we know exactly what's going on. So I don't recommend eliminating the words my and mine from your vocabulary. You'll just weird everybody out and be hard to understand. Okay. Okay. And that looks like it. Any other questions? No? Okay, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.